They say every photograph captures a soul, a fragment of time sealed between light and shadow. But what happens when that soul refuses to stay silent? It was the year 1910, deep in the heart of London's winter. A pale sun lingered behind a curtain of fog, casting a cold, colorless glow through the window of a narrow Victorian home. Inside, the air was still, so still that even the sound of breathing felt intrusive. The scent of roses and candle wax filled the parlor, and in the center of that silence sat a wooden chair draped in white lace. Upon it rested the fragile body of a little girl, Eliza Gray, just 5 years old, her tiny hands folded neatly, her face calm as sleep. Her mother stood beside her, veiled in black mourning silk, eyes hollow, tears long since spent. For her, the only thing left to hold on to was memory, and memory in those days was captured through death itself. A photographer had been summoned, a man who made his living preserving the departed in delicate portraits of eternal rest. He arranged his camera carefully. His heart was uneasy as he looked through the lens at the child before him. Outside, the wind moaned softly in a sound that felt almost human. He took a breath, adjusted the focus, and then the shutter clicked. A sound so small, yet one that would echo for more than a century. When the image was developed hours later, he noticed something impossible. Eliza's face was serene, peaceful, but her left eye, it was slightly open. A thin glimmer of reflected light shimmered inside it, as if that lifeless body had seen him and blinked. That night, the photographer packed his tools, swearing never to enter that house again, because he knew what he had seen and what he had captured was not meant to be photographed. The story begins in silence, the kind of silence that feels alive. That December morning in 1910, the city was asleep under a blanket of gray fog. Horses' hooves echoed faintly on cobblestone streets, and the distant toll of church bells bled into the still air. Inside a modest Victorian townhouse, the Gray family was preparing for something sacred and unthinkable. Eliza's mother, Margaret Gray, moved like a shadow through the parlor, carefully adjusting the lace that covered her daughter's small form. There was a strange peace in her face, a peace that only comes when grief has burned itself out completely. Her husband Thomas stood by the window, his trembling hand clutching a silver pocket watch that no longer kept time. For him, time had already stopped, the moment his daughter's heart did. In those days, death wasn't hidden behind closed doors. It was welcomed, faced, and photographed. It was the Victorian way, to honor life by embracing the stillness of death. And so they called upon a photographer named Edward Hanley, a quiet man with tired eyes who had seen far too much death through his lens. When Edward arrived, the room greeted him with cold air and the faint scent of lilies. He bowed gently, setting his tripod beside the chair where Eliza sat, dressed in her best Sunday gown, white lace, small shoes polished to a faint shine, and a delicate ribbon tied through her golden hair. She looked almost alive, too alive. Edward adjusted his camera, trying not to meet the mother's eyes. He had done this 100 times before, but something about this child unsettled him. The light was soft that morning, creeping through the tall window in golden stripes that touched her face just enough to bring warmth to her pale cheeks. He whispered a short prayer under his breath, and then the shutter clicked, a single flash, then silence again. He thought it was over, but the instant the sound faded, a chill swept through the room so sharp it felt almost deliberate. As if the air itself had exhaled, Edward's heart skipped. For just a second, he could have sworn the girl's fingers twitched. So small, so slight. He blinked, and it was gone. He told himself it was the candlelight. It had to be, but something deep inside whispered otherwise. That photograph, that moment, wasn't as still as it seemed. Hours passed, but the unease never left Edward Hanley. He sat in the corner of the Gray family's parlor, developing the photograph in his portable darkroom. The scent of chemicals hung heavy, sharp, metallic, and cold, the scent of ghosts, some photographers used to say. As the image began to appear on the glass plate, Edward felt his chest tighten. Slowly, the shapes emerged. The chair, the flowers, the dim folds of mourning cloth. And then her, little Eliza Gray, her face captured in haunting perfection. Eyes faintly open, not wide, but just enough to glimmer under the soft light. One eye seemed clearer, almost aware, as though it had reacted to the flash. Edward stepped back, heart hammering. He wiped his hands on his apron, leaving streaks of dark fluid. He leaned in again, studying the child's expression. There was something different between the first exposure and the negative he held. Her head, it was slightly tilted, barely noticeable, but not the same as before. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "Fatigue, Edward. You're tired, that's all." But even as he said it, the air felt heavier. The quiet of the room deepened into something else, something sentient. When Margaret returned to collect the photo, her hands trembled as she took it. She held it close, eyes wet with disbelief. "She looks alive," she whispered. "You gave her back to me." Edward forced a smile, but inside, dread coiled tight. Because he didn't give her life. He only captured what was already there. Something he shouldn't have captured. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He kept the original negative on his desk, unable to destroy it, unable to stop staring. Each time he looked, he swore the same thing. The child's half-open eye was looking directly at him, as though her gaze had shifted just slightly from the first glance. By the third night, he began to see faint motion in the shadows, a flicker of her white ribbon, a hint of reflection in glass. Not enough to be certain, but enough to make his blood run cold. The camera had done its job. But maybe it had also opened something else, something that never should have been seen. Weeks passed, but Edward couldn't bring himself to part with the glass plate negative. It sat wrapped in black cloth inside his study, hidden from the daylight. And yet, somehow, it never felt still. He tried to convince himself that he was only imagining it. But when he closed his eyes at night, he could still see the child's half-open eye staring back from the shadows, a glint of awareness that refused to die. He began noticing strange things around his home. The faint sound of a child's hum echoing through the hallway, footsteps pacing in the attic above his dark room, and the unmistakable scent of lilies, the same flowers that had surrounded Eliza's chair. One evening, while reviewing his collection of older portraits, Edward noticed something impossible. The image of Eliza, stored safely between two glass plates, had changed. Her face was brighter now, the sepia tones warming as if touched by life. The slight tilt of her head was different, and the faintest curve of her lips suggested a smile, a fragile, haunting smile that no dead child could ever make. He dropped the plate, but it didn't shatter. It hit the wooden floor with a dull, ringing note, like the sound of something hollow. Edward knelt to pick it up, trembling. In the reflection of the polished glass, he saw not just his own weary face, but a flicker of movement. A second reflection behind him. He turned sharply. The room was empty. Only the candle flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that swayed against the wallpaper. But then came the whisper. Soft, broken, like the faint exhale of a child learning to breathe again. "Mr. Hanley." He froze. The voice was small, familiar. He'd heard it once before, in that silent parlor when he'd sworn her fingers had twitched. Edward stumbled back, knocking over his lamp. The glass negative slid from his hands and clattered across the floor, the image catching the dying flame just for a heartbeat. And in that instant, he saw it. Eliza's eye, wide open. Not half, not faint, open. The photograph was no longer fading. It was waking. By the time autumn crept across the city, Edward Hanley was no longer the man people remembered. His eyes, once sharp and steady, now trembled with sleeplessness. He had stopped taking new portraits. Clients whispered that the light in his studio had gone strange, that every photograph he took came out wrong. Faces blurred where they shouldn't. Shadows appeared where none had been. And always, behind it all, faint, almost invisible, was the silhouette of a child. He tried to burn the glass plate once. He carried it out to the yard behind his studio, placed it beneath a low fire, and waited for the image to melt away. But when the flames touched the glass, the fire dimmed, as though something inside the plate was absorbing the light itself. The image remained untouched, and that night, the whispers returned. He began to see her reflection in mirrors, in windows, in the sheen of silver instruments he used to clean his lenses. Each time her face was closer, more alive. Her one open eye followed him, not accusingly, but pleadingly, as if she were trapped between one breath and the next. Edward turned to the scriptures he had long abandoned. He sought priests, mediums, even photographers who studied spirit photography, those who claimed that certain cameras could capture the soul itself. They told him something he didn't want to hear. Every image is a mirror, Mr. Hanley, and when you stare too deeply into it, sometimes it stares back. He was warned never to photograph the dead again, never to fix the spirit in glass. But it was too late. Eliza had already crossed that threshold. One evening, in the dim amber light of his studio, Edward heard the familiar sound, the click of a shutter. But he hadn't touched the camera. It sat on the table, its mechanism moving on its own, slowly winding, as if something unseen had pressed it. The lens pointed toward the wall, yet when Edward developed the exposure, the image that formed made his blood freeze. It wasn't the wall. It was him, asleep in his chair, and behind him, visible in horrifying clarity, stood the girl from the funeral. Her small hand rested gently on his shoulder. For days, Edward refused to enter his studio. He locked the door, boarded the windows, and tried to drown the silence with prayer. But no matter how hard he tried, the whispers followed, echoing softly through the cracks in his walls, tracing every heartbeat like an unfinished melody. And always that name, Eliza. It became more than a voice, and it was a presence, gentle but constant, like a memory that refused to die. Finally, one night, Edward gave in. He lit a single oil lamp and descended into his studio. The air was still, thick with the smell of dust and chemicals. The covered camera sat where he'd left it, its brass frame glinting under the low flame. He approached the locked cabinet where the photograph had been hidden. His hands trembled as he unwrapped the black cloth from the glass plate. For a long moment he could not breathe. The image had changed again. Eliza's face was clearer now, not pale or lifeless, but soft and radiant, as though light was seeping through the photograph itself. The faint shimmer of her open eye seemed almost liquid, alive with something beyond human understanding. And then, without warning, the glass pulsed, a faint vibration. Like the tremor of a heartbeat, Edward staggered back. The room grew colder. The lamplight flickered and bent, casting long streaks of gold across the floorboards. From within the plate, a soft sound emerged. Not a whisper this time, but a sigh. And then a voice, clear, trembling, innocent. "You took me home." Edward froze. He understood. The child had never been angry. She wasn't haunting him. She was awake. The camera hadn't trapped her. It had preserved something, a fragment of her soul, caught between death and eternity, searching for peace. Tears filled his eyes. He knelt before the image and whispered, "I didn't mean to bind you." And in the reflection of that fragile glass, he saw her smile, gentle, forgiving. The lamp dimmed, and for a moment the studio was filled with warm light, as if dawn had broken through the walls themselves. Then silence. The air grew still again, and when Edward looked back down, the image on the glass was gone. Only a faint imprint of light remained, as if the soul it held had finally been released. When morning came, Edward awoke to silence, a silence so complete it felt almost sacred. The city outside was still, a pale mist drifting between the rooftops like breath from another world. He rose slowly, his eyes drawn toward the light seeping under the studio door. Something compelled him to enter once more, though a quiet part of him already knew what he would find. The photograph that had haunted him for months lay shattered on the floor, its fragments glimmering faintly in the sunlight, each one holding a tiny reflection of Eliza's face. But her eyes were closed now, peaceful, resting. Edward knelt among the shards, his trembling hands hovering just above them. In the glints of glass he saw not fear, but release. The curse had never been a punishment. It was a plea, A soul caught between memory and eternity, waiting to be seen one last time, and then set free. He understood now. Photography had never been about capturing the dead. It was about remembering the living. Each photograph, each flicker of light, was a prayer whispered between two worlds. Edward stood, the dawn spilling across his face. The scent of lilies faded from the air. The whisper that had followed him through every waking hour was gone. But in that absence there was peace. He left the studio door open that morning, the first time in months. He walked outside carrying only his old camera. The fog had lifted and sunlight touched the cobblestones like gold, and for the first time he pointed his lens not toward sorrow, but toward life. Children playing in the street, a woman smiling through her window, light, movement, breath. Weeks later the townsfolk would find his studio empty. The glass plates are gone. Only one remained. Resting gently on the wooden table, its image is faint but unmistakable. It was the same chair, the same parlor, but no child sat there. Only light, shimmering softly as though someone had finally exhaled. They say Edward disappeared soon after. Some claimed he went mad. Others believed he found what he'd been searching for all along. Proof that the soul never truly fades. But those who look closely at his final photograph swear they've seen it. In the reflection of the glass behind the veil of light, a single open eye blinking once, then closing forever. There are moments in time that refuse to die. Photographs that breathe, memories that whisper, faces that linger long after the body is gone. Edward Hanley's story reminds us that a photograph is not just an image. It's a mirror of the soul, a fragile bridge between the living and the light. When his camera captured Eliza Gray, it didn't just preserve her likeness. It awakened something eternal. A presence that wanted to be remembered, not as a ghost, but as a soul yearning for peace. And maybe that's the message hidden inside every haunting. That what we fear isn't the dead reaching out to us, but the memories we've buried are too deep. The love that refuses to fade. The unfinished goodbyes that echo between this world and the next. If you've ever stared into an old photograph and felt something staring back, a pulse, a breath, a flicker of recognition, maybe it wasn't your imagination. Maybe, for just a moment, you brushed against the edge of eternity, because souls don't vanish. They shift, they transform, they find new ways to be seen. And sometimes they blink, just once, to let us know they're still here. And as you watch this, look around your own home. The pictures on your walls, the faded faces in frames, the family portraits no one looks at anymore. What if one of them is still waiting for you to notice? If you felt the presence of this story, then you've already walked through the veil. Subscribe to Truth Uncaged, where we uncover what lies between the living and the unseen, the forgotten, the eternal, the truth that waits in silence. Because every story here is a heartbeat, echoing from the other side.